The comedy boom and the bright lights of absurdity by the mid-1980s, laughter had become big business. Every major network wanted its own comedy that could glue families to the couch. And the competition created some of the strangest, most inventive shows ever aired. Television executives were convinced that anything could work if it made people smile, and so
the decade became a playground for ideas that swung wildly between genius and insanity. The results were glorious.
one of those gems was the Newhart Show. In an age when most sitcoms screamed for attention, Bob Newhart whispered his way into our hearts. His dry, understated delivery was a breath of calm in a decade that loved noise. The humor was slow, smart, and quietly ridiculous. It revolved around an inn in Vermont, where eccentric townsfolk seemed to exist solely to test Newhart's patience. The magic of Newhart lay in its rhythm-awkward pauses, blank stares, the kind of silence that made the punchlines even funnier. When the show ended with one of the most legendary twist finales in television history, audiences laughed, cried, and wondered how something so gentle had become so unforgettable. Meanwhile, over in another corner of the television universe, absurdity reigned supreme. Get Alive, starring Chris Elliott, felt like a fever dream squeezed into a 30-minute slot. It followed a 30-year-old paperboy living with his parents, drifting through bizarre adventures that felt more like surreal sketches than sitcom episodes. There was an odd brilliance to Ether. Humor was self-aware, the tone almost anarchic. It wasn't for everyone, but for those who got it, Get a Life was a secret handshake among fans of truly weird comedy. But not all. 1980s comedy was built on chaos. Family Ties gave audiences a look at the culture clash between 1960s idealism and Reagan-era ambition. The parents were aging hippies. Their son, played by Michael J. Fox, was a young conservative obsessed with business and success. The show was funny, but it was also a snapshot of America's generational shift. It balanced laughter with real emotion, something the 1980s sitcoms did better than they often given credit for. Behind every punchline was a message about change, compromise, and the love that holds families together even when their values collide. And then there was the facts of life, which took the boarding school setting of different strokes and turned it into a warm, funny, and occasionally tear-jerking series about growing up. Its characters were flawed, its humor relatable, and its tone surprisingly mature. It didn't rely on gimmicks. It relied on honesty. That's what made it endure long after most other sitcoms faded into static. Still, the 1980s couldn't resist blending reality with absurdity. Mama's Family brought sketch comedy characters to primetime line. Vicki Lawrence's portrayal of a cranky Southern matriarch turned family dysfunction into art. The show was loud, messy, and gloriously unfiltered. It felt like a holiday gathering that never ended, full of love, resentment, and laughter that came from recognizing your own relatives in every scene. Man, will Kate and Allie quietly broke boundaries by portraying two divorced women raising their kids together under one roof. It was progressive for its time, but it never felt like a political statement. It was just funny and real. The chemistry between Susan St. James and Jane Curtin carried every ever, proving that comedy about friendship could be just as powerful as romance or family drama. And how could anyone forget Bosom Buddies? Before Tom Hanks became an Oscar magnate, he was one of two young men dressing as women just to score cheap rent in an all-female apartment building. The premise sounds impossible now, yet the show's charm came from its heart. Beneath the slapstick disguises and gender-bending hijinks was a story about friendship, identity, and the situations people stumble into and chasing. And while American sitcoms were stretching their imaginations, British humor was sneaking across the Atlantic. PBS and cable reruns introduced audiences to Faulty Towers. And yes, minister shows that proved you didn't need explosions or aliens to be funny. You just needed sharp writing. American networks took notes, and soon their own comedies began mixing that cleverness with Hollywood energy. In the middle of this creative storm appeared WKRP in Cincinnati. It wasn't just a show about a radio station. It was about the misfits behind the microphone. DJs, managers, and salespeople collided in an endless dance of chaos and humanity. Its humor came from timing and authenticity writers who actually knew what it was like to work in broadcasting. The Thanksgiving turkey episode, where the station drops live turkeys from a helicopter, remains one of the funniest moments in television history. Few people remember how daring that show was, how perfectly it balanced realism with absurdity.
As the decade rolled forward, television began to celebrate underdogs.
Benson followed a sharp-tongued butler who outsmarted every politician around him. His sarcasm was legendary, and his intelligence turned every episode into a battle of wits.
The show stood out because it trusted the audience to keep up.
It didn't explain. Its jokes it delivered them with confidence.
Meanwhile, Night Court
Continued to prove that even the most chaotic settings could hide enormous heart. Its humor ranged from broad slapstick to biting satire, often within the same scene. Watching it now, you realize it wasn't just funny, it was fearless. It tackled loneliness, justice, and human absurdity, all while making you laugh through tears. And then came The Duck Factory, a short-lived series starring a young Jim Carrey long before Ace Ventura. Set inside an animation studio.
It was a meta-comedy about the people who create cartoons but can't quite get their own lives together.
It was weirdly ahead of its time in early glimpse of the self-referential humor that would dominate decades later.
Sadly, it barely lasted a season.
But it remains a hidden gem for anyone curious about where comedy legends got their start. Some comedies leaned into fantasy instead of satire. Out of This World told the story of a teenage girl who could freeze time with her fingers half human, half alien, completely awkward. The special effects were primitive but charming, and the writing was pure wish fulfillment for anyone who ever dreamed of pausing life to avoid embarrassment. The humor came from the struggle between wanting to be normal and realizing you never will be. Another forgotten delight was My Two Dads, which arrived just as the decade was winding down. The premise was simple. Two very different men raising a teenage girl after her mother's death. It could have been melodrama, but it wasn't. It was funny, touching, and modern in ways that surprised people. The message was quiet, but powerful that family isn't about structure. It's about love. Behind the scenes, the 1980s comedy boom was powered by experimentation. Writers were free to take chances. Audiences were willing to follow. Cable television was expanding, creating room for niche humor. Sketch shows like SCTV and Fridays offered playgrounds for future stars Eugene Levy, John Candy, Larry David, all testing boundaries that traditional sitcoms couldn't. Their sketches were unpredictable, often chaotic, and occasionally brilliant. They planted seeds that would grow into the next generation of comedy. But with success came saturation. By the late 1980s, networks were drowning in laugh tracks. Every time slot was a battlefield. and audiences began to crave something fresh. Some shows survived, others vanished overnight. One week, you were America's favorite. The next, you were a trivia question. Yet, even in their disappearances, comedies left fingerprints on everything that followed. The smart writing of Newhart influenced Seinfeld. The family warmth of Who's the Boss inspired Friends and Modern Family. The absurd confidence of Sledgehammer paved the way for Brooklyn Nine-Nine. The echoes of the 1980s never really faded, they just evolved. Still, memory is a funny thing. When people look back at the 80s now, they remember the big hits, the shows that became cultural mountains. But hidden beneath those peaks were valleys filled with laughter just as rich, whose star zone is. That's what makes revisiting them so powerful. It's not just about nostalgia. It's about rediscovering the spirit of creativity that dared to fail boldly. Television today. The 1980s were none of those things. They were messy, passionate, and gloriously human. Writers built jokes from heartache. Producers gambled on ideas no spreadsheet could predict. And audiences rewarded them with loyalty that feels almost mythical now. Those forgotten shows may never trend again, but their DNA runs through every modern sitcom that tries to make you laugh while making you feel something deeper. The laughter of the 1980s wasn't perfect. It was too loud, too silly, too earnest, but that's exactly why it mattered. It came from a place of optimism, from a belief that humor could fix anything. And maybe that's what we've lost a little. Because when you rewind the tape far enough back to the static and neon glow, you realize those shows weren't just funny. They were a reflection of who we were when we believed life could always end with a laugh and a hug before the credits rolled.